The price of peace is loneliness. A lot of times people have this idea that when they are trying to experience peace, this immediately just means cutting off everyone and moving away or doing this thing. When that can be the case, loneliness now makes it a lot easier to move on, to, value yourself and have all these things that are better for you. But I do feel like sometimes it's less about solitude and more about self-preservation. As soon as you can start to preserve yourself and you have this idea that no matter, what people do to you, you will feel okay, you will be okay, that is what it means to have that peace. And a lot of times when you hold yourself to that standard, you have to realize that now it makes it harder to find relationships. The more you value yourself, the harder it's going to be to find someone that sees it the same way, the more emotional you are. All these things definitely coexist and they intertwine when you really think about it. The more you value yourself, the harder it's going to be to have a relationship. When you have these standards and these things that are very important to you, you have to realize that that complexity now makes it harder to find people that are like-minded. It's going to make it harder to kind of have that attraction and that pull towards people because you are putting so much time into yourself, and people aren't doing that. You only know other people as deep as you know yourself. When you are trying to form these connections and people are shallow or people aren't able to provide you with that, intellectual intimacy that you're looking for, it only makes sense that you are alone. It only makes sense that it's hard to find this thing, and when we are trying so hard to find that peace, we have to realize that the price we pay is that isolation. When we are trying to, stay in this solitude, it can kind of damage us in the end when we are trying so hard to stay there. When we are trying so hard to be alone, it really comes down to preservation. We can preserve ourselves. We can be able to understand that what we're looking for is out there. We just haven't found it yet. And there's nothing we can do that can make this suffering more or to make this peace kind of be damaged. It's really just how you're seeing, your own reality. And I feel like when you're seeing your own reality for what it is and what you want it to be, you can be a lot more aware that that isolation is now something that you can break apart from. And I feel like when I am saying, the price of peace causes you to be isolated, it only makes sense. You think about all the things that cause you problems, and yeah, you could say people are a lot of it, but people are a lot of the good. But I do feel like when you are in that state of solitude, in that state of isolation, and you're not relying on other people, that is what I mean by loneliness. It's not that you're not ever talking to people or not doing anything. It's the intimacy that you're missing out on. And that intimacy, even though sometimes it might not seem real, it might seem temporary, it might seem like these things, but I do feel like when you do want to have peace, a lot of times it comes down to who you allow in your life. The people that you allow, the people that you are, being very open and communicating with will say a lot about what you want in the end, that peace that you're looking for. And I feel like if we do want to find, this level of peace, this level of, certainty within our own, comfort, we have to be a lot more careful with who we allow in our life. The people that you allow now get to have, that emotional pull on you. As soon as you become an emotionally independent person, that's when you kind of break away from it. But that independency is very hard to navigate. It's very hard to find. And I feel like a lot of times people struggle in knowing how to be emotionally independent. How to be, this person that makes their emotions so much more expensive that you don't let little things hurt you. It's only going to make you more susceptible to that hurt. The more emotion you give people, the easier it'll be for them to hurt you. It's like holding a grudge. It's doing these things that hurt yourself, more than anything. You have to learn to detach from them. You have to learn, that you can be emotionally independent to where people aren't affecting your mood. People aren't changing how you feel about life. When someone's leaving you undelivered or someone's, treating you a certain way, even then, you are hurting yourself by allowing them to have that much pull over you, that much effect on you. And I think that resilience is something that you have to practice. That resilience is part of your peace now, being able to understand that no matter what these people do, I'm still me. I still have, the ability to control the things that are controllable. It gets a lot easier when you're worried about what other people view you as or what other people want from you. That is only going to make it harder. That's only going to make, having a relationship or having people in your life that you care about so much more difficult because you're putting so much energy on them. You're relying on them so much. Stop relying on people to make you feel better or to make you feel sane. Even when you're looking for validation, the only validation you need is the validation within yourself. as soon as you start relying on external validation, you lose yourself. You will no longer have your own ideas because you are relying so hard on these expectations other people have set on you. And instead of becoming the person you're supposed to be, you will now follow, the potential, these labels people have put on you so hard to where you won't become yourself. You won't be able to have your own ideas. You won't be able to have your own feelings because you've been listening to what people have been telling you for so long. You have to be more emotionally independent in this sense. You have to have your own, course through what you want to experience and what you want to perceive as. The reality that you're living in all comes down to your perception. And if you're relying on how other people perceive you, what's that say about yourself? What's that say about what you actually want to feel and experience? The relationships, the connections, everything that you are doing, if you're letting it be dependent on what other people view you as, what other people feel you deserve, it's no longer yours. It's no longer something that is, authentic to yourself because it's for other people to look at. It's for other people to, congratulate or be proud at. And that makes it so much harder to live when you're living to other people's, expectations. As soon as you remove all these things, that I'm talking about, like the validation, like, the problems, like being emotionally dependent, that price you pay in that peace is all these things. It's the work that you put into yourself that now makes that price, so much more cheaper. It's like a discount. Each time you're able to do these things, the price for peace gets cheaper. And I think that price is something that we have to pay at the end of the day. It's a toll. It's like healing. It's something that you are actively tending to make sure it continues, to make sure it isn't something that is controlling you or damaging you, but it's how you see yourself. And I think if we can break away from that and break away from, how other people view us more than anything, that is the biggest piece. That is the biggest part of having peace, is being comfortable in who you are. And a lot of people have this idea that, no, I'm comfortable in who I am. None of this thing, really matters. When really, I feel like if you are still listening to outside noise, if you are still letting, a like count, people that follow you or people, a comment or some gossip, still control you, you're not as comfortable as you think you are. As much as you want to be comfortable, you have to realize that comfort will leave you as soon as you start relying on how other people see you. And I think if we want to feel better about that, if we want to, actually have this level of peace that we're looking for, a lot of it comes down to our own perception, and our perception has to be something that we are comfortable and confident in. It's something that means a lot to you, and what it means to you means more than what it means to these other people. You're relying so much on how these other people view that you can't even chase your own goals. You can't even chase your own ambitions because you feel like it has to align with these other people, when really that's not the case at all. And I think if you really want to feel that level of peace and being, aware and being able to handle information without making it, definite your character or your self-esteem or your confidence, it all comes down to acceptance, and being confident in that sense. That confidence is something that you need to have if you want to live in peace. Living in peace doesn't mean shutting the doors for everyone around you. It means letting them come through those doors, and whatever they do within those walls, is something that you can be okay with. You did this, you treated me this way, cool. You can leave, you can do this, you can do that. And I think as soon as we are more comfortable with these, uncontrollable things, it gets a lot easier. It's not something that we have to box ourselves in with. When you build those walls around yourself too high, a lot of times it can get very hard to let people in. Now you don't know, what you're doing or what you want because you've been focused on being solo for so long. When you build those emotional walls too high around you, sometimes you don't know when to let them down. Sometimes you don't know how. And when you want to build, actual intimacy, it's going to be that much harder because for the past few months, the past few years, you've been telling yourself that it's not something you want. You've been lying to yourself. You've had this idea that what you're looking for isn't capable, isn't plausible for you. When really it's only going to get harder. The longer you live in this idea that you are unlovable, that people are always going to have, bad motives when it comes to you, it's only going to make things more difficult. If you want to actually have these relationships and actually have these things that actually matter, you have to be able to let the walls down. You have to not box yourself in when you get hurt, but you have to be able to move on. Moving on and healing is something that you actively have to do. That's something you have to tend towards daily. And if you just have this idea that I'm going to shut myself down forever and no one will have this access to me, it's going to hurt you in the long run. You know, now you are preparing yourself for future heartbreak because the people you want to give love to, you don't know how. You know, you don't know what to do. You don't know how to do it. And it only makes relationships harder. And I think when we are relying on that, you know, relying on us to randomly build this, you know, backbone to know when to shut down and when to take down the walls, it makes, you know, falling for people and having these relationships that much more difficult. And if we want to really have peace, you know, over all of this, it's being able to still be who you are, still be content, still handle all these pressures and all these things you can't control, and moving on with it. I don't want you to see this video and have this idea that, oh, well, I have to isolate myself now to feel okay. No, you have to be able to isolate your feelings, isolate your emotions, and to know that that's enough. You know, they don't have to be things that control you or damage you, or that whatever people do towards their emotions have to be a part of you. It's something you can see and move on with. It all comes down to being able to move on. You know, how well you can preserve yourself and take care of yourself means a lot more than you think. And if you want to have better relationships, you want to have, you know, better connections with these people, that's exactly what you have to do. You have to be able to be comfortable enough to know that whatever you do won't affect me. It won't damage me. And that's living in peace. You know, that's having enough peace to know that whatever people do, I'm still comfortable and confident enough to know I'm okay. If you can be okay, if you can deal with anything and still be okay, that is the biggest thing to have. That is the biggest takeaway you need to have when you want to have relationships work, when you want to build relationships. All these things come down to, you know, your readiness of disappointment. And I think having peace is ultimately something you have to pay for. In whatever way you seem fit, you will be paying for it with something. And I think that's inevitable. Your sanity, whatever that thing may be, to feel okay, your emotions, your dependency, pay that in order to be yourself, in order to find the things that are for you. Because when you're more focused, when you do have that peace, now it gets so much easier to see life for what it is, to see yourself for who you are and who you want to be. You know, you're not relying on anyone now. You're not looking for anyone to change this or make this or do that. You can be okay within yourself. And that being okay, I think is the biggest part of having peace, is knowing that you control what you can control, and, you know, anything outside of that shouldn't affect you. That is what it means to live in peace. That is what it means to live, you know, knowing that you have put every cost to it to have your peace.